Hannah's going to come now and read our sermon passage.
This is from Ruth 1. In the days when the judges ruled, there was a famine in the land, and a man of Bethlehem in Judah went to sojourn in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife Naomi, and the names of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. They were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went into the country of Moab and remained there. But Elimelech, the husband of Naomi, died, and she was left with her 2 sons. These took Moabite wives, and the name of one was Orpah, and the name of the other was Ruth. They lived there for about 10 years, and both Mahlon and Chilion died, so that the woman was left without her 2 sons and her husband. Then she arose with her daughters-in-law to return from the country of Moab, for she had heard in the fields of Moab that the Lord had visited his people and given them food. So she set out from the place where she was with her 2 daughters-in-law, and they went on their way to return to the land of Judah. But Naomi said to her 2 daughters-in-laws, "Go, return each of you to your mother's house. May the Lord deal kindly with you, as you have dealt with the dead and with me. The Lord grant that you may find rest, each of you, in the house of her husband." Then she kissed them, and they lifted up their voices and wept. And they said to her, "No, we will return with you to your people." But Naomi said, "Turn back, my daughters. Why will you go with me? Have I yet sons in my womb that they may become your husbands? Turn back, my daughters. Go your way, for I am too old to have a husband. If I should say I have hope, even if I should have a husband this night and should bear sons, would you therefore wait till they were grown? Would you therefore refrain from marrying? No, my daughters, for it is exceedingly bitter to me for your sake that the hand of the Lord has gone out against me." Then they lifted up their voices and wept again, and Orpah kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And she said, "See, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law." But Ruth said, "Do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you. For where you go, I will go, and where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. May the Lord do so to me, and more also if anything, but death parts me from you." And when Naomi saw that she was determined to go with her, she said no more. So the 2 of them went on until they came to Bethlehem. And when they came to Bethlehem, the whole town was stirred because of them. And the woman said, "Is this Naomi?" She said to them, "Do not call me Naomi, call me Mara, for the Almighty has dealt very bitterly with me. I went away full, the Lord has brought me back empty. Why call me Naomi when the Lord has testified against me, and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" So Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabite, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab, and they came to Bethlehem at the beginning of barley harvest. This has been the word of the Lord.
Today we're in the book of Ruth, and we're going to cover all 4 chapters of Ruth without reading it. We just read the first chapter, and it's not very long. It would take you 15 minutes to read the book of Ruth. I considered reading the whole thing, but we're going to hit the highlights of it today. If you're not familiar with the book of Ruth, it was a story that happened around 1100 BC in the Second Iron Age. It describes the story of Naomi and her daughter-in-law, Ruth. So Mother's Day is a day that is above all else about love, the love of God through mothers in the tender way that it is meant to be given in nurturing to their children. You'll remember last year, possibly, if you remember what I said a year ago, probably not, but maybe, that I was with a fellowship of pastors before Mother's Day, asked them what they were doing for Mother's Day, since I'm new to being a pastor in the United States. 20 years we lived out of the country where, as it says in The Lion, the Witch, and the Wardrobe, where it's always winter but never Christmas. There it's always spring and never Mother's Day. And so we didn't have Mother's Day for a long time in North Africa, so I came back here pastoring people. I want to recognize moms, and pastors told me that they avoid Mother's Day, saying much about it, because it's associated with a lot of pain in a lot of people's lives. And in truth, that wherever there's great hope and great expectations and great love, there's also great loss and great desires that are still left unfulfilled. George Orwell, famous writer, speaks about that price. He said, "One is prepared in the end to be defeated and broken up by life, which is the inevitable price of fastening one's love upon another human individual." And he's right, that you give yourself in love to a person, and it is inevitable that, as he says, you'll be broken up by life. C.S. Lewis said this about the effort to avoid that pain. He says, "There is no safe investment. To love at all is to be vulnerable. Love anything, and your heart will certainly be wrung and possibly broken. If you want to be sure of keeping it intact, you must give your heart to no one, not even to an animal. Wrap it carefully around with hobbies and little luxuries. Avoid all entanglements. Lock it up safe in the casket or coffin of your selfishness. But in that casket, safe, dark, motionless, airless, it will change. It will not be broken, but it will become unbreakable, impenetrable, irredeemable. The only place outside of heaven where you can be perfectly safe from all the dangers and perturbations of love is hell." So C.S. Lewis makes the point that to really avoid the pain, you would have to be in one of two places: heaven, where there is no pain because of love, and there is love without pain, and hell, where there is no love. And so to avoid, I think, speaking about the pain, the loss, the bitterness that is accompanied with that love on Mother's Day, is to avoid all of the themes that mean anything to us in the Bible. God's Word does not avoid the topic of pain. In fact, His book is full of the most painful stories. Job, slavery in Egypt for 400 years, wandering in the wilderness for a generation, for a lifetime, the absolute destruction of the northern and southern kingdom of Israel, and finally, in the new covenant, the cross. So today we're going to look at the story of two famous mothers who were well acquainted with grief and bitterness, Naomi and Ruth. Their story is one of bitterness and pain, and it helps us to understand one important question. And I'm going to do that by looking at the meaning of the words. As Hannah read for us this passage, it tells the story of this woman, but it would help us to know that if you were to read this in Hebrew, which it was originally written in, each of these names have meanings. So on the next one, you could see that the city that they left was Bethlehem. You'll maybe recognize this. Some of you are learning Arabic. The word Beit means home, and Lehem, it can mean meat or food. In Hebrew, it means bread. So Bethlehem means the house of bread. That's the town that Ruth and Naomi were from. And they went to a place called Moab. And you might as well in Arabic recognize the word ab. It means father. And Mo in the Hebrew language can mean who. And so Moab was a group of people, or a tribe, that was started by Lot's incestuous relationship with his two daughters. And because of the shame of those relationships, the Moabites were called the Who's the Father tribe, because they didn't want to talk about who the father was of these two ladies. So you may, of these children. So you may call this tribe or this land the "Who's Your Daddy" land. Elimelech was Naomi's husband, and his name meant El, which is God, or comes from the word Elohim in Hebrew, and Melech, which means king. You'll also recognize that from Arabic potentially. So his name was God is King. Naomi, her name was Pleasant. Malon and Chilion meant weak and frail, respectively. And the name that Naomi wanted to be renamed from Pleasant was the name Bitter. Ruth and Orpah mean friendship and fawn, but surely history would tell us that these were not their given names. Their names in the Moabite language is lost to history. They were given Hebrew names. So when Naomi's children met these two women, they would be, for the Hebrew people, names that they would not even want to say because of the shame of marrying someone from that particular culture. So if we were to reread this in Hebrew, it would sound to their ears something like this. A young lady named Pleasant lived in a land of abundance called the House of Bread. With her husband, God is King. She had two sons named Weak and Frail, but that was okay because her husband was God is King. But a famine came to the land of bread, and they fled the land to a place called Who's Your Daddy? There in that land, God is King died. And if that wasn't bad enough, her sons, Weak and Frail, married women without names from a family that was of no use. At the very bottom, Pleasant's sons, Weak and Frail, died and left her destitute. Pleasant, now an old woman, decided to return to her land with just one of her no-name daughters to the house of bread. But she was empty and as good as dead. God had turned his hand against her, and she wanted a new name that would be less ironic than her first, Bitter. This story is one of a life whose reality fell far short from Naomi's hopes, dreams, and even expectations. If you are alive very long, your life will look like that at some point. The gap between your hopes and your dreams and your reality. And so this book of Ruth helps us answer the big question: will God redeem our bitterness? Will God redeem the bitterness that exists in the sweet day of Mother's Day? And so our title is Redeeming Mother's Day, to answer that question. I originally had phrased that question of, can God redeem bitterness? But I don't think that was Naomi's question, and I really don't think it's yours and mine. We believe God can. If you were to ask anybody, can God? We would always say, if you believe in God at all, yes, he's powerful and he can. But the big question on our hearts and on Naomi's heart on that day is, will God redeem, make better, soothe, calm the bitterness of our lives? So we're going to look at a redemptive arc, and we're going to look at this story and pick out parts of chapters 2, 3, and 4 to come to our conclusions about this question, will God redeem our bitterness? So we're going to fill this in. If you take notes, especially the kids, this may be a little bit more entertaining or memorable, let's say that, than a normal outline. So this is going to show the arc of the story and how our lives descend into this bitterness, and then how the Lord promises his redemption. So let's start at the beginning. Jehovah redeemed. You'll notice at the very beginning of this book, of this little 4 chapters, it starts with the simple phrase, in the days when the judges ruled. The first phrase of this book gives us our context inside of the redemptive history of Israel. These were days when the judges ruled. What does that mean? Well, to you and me, if you haven't read the whole Bible, you may think that doesn't mean much. But if you've read the whole story from Genesis to Revelation, you'll recognize that the days of the judges came after the people of God came into the land of Canaan and took it. And it comes after their redemption from Egypt, how God brought them out of Egypt and how he faithfully fed them and even watered them, gave them meat and bread in the wilderness on their way to the promised land. He brought them over the Jordan by separating the water. Actually, they walked into the water first, and he separated it, and he caused them to gain victory in that land that he had promised them. Generations later, the judges were ruling in the shadow of what God had already done for them, in the shadow of redemption. So for Naomi to be born into this community in Bethlehem, she was born into a community or a society that knew Jehovah because he had revealed himself to them not only in word but also in action. He had shown who he was. He had shown that sovereignty, Alex, if you could help me out with this next one, means three things: that he is Jehovah, is good, wise, and all-powerful. These are the three parts of God's sovereignty that we shared with our kids last year in the names of God, what it means that God is sovereign, that he is all-powerful. And that's the one that we, I think, don't so much learn from the story from Ruth. But we also know that he's wise, and I think all of us with our limited wisdom, when we come across what seem like very simple problems that we can't figure out, we inherently know, I think, that God is wise. But what we really doubt is that he is good in the experiences of life. And so this is something that God showed to his people as he brought them out of Egypt, that not only is he all-powerful, he showed them this through the plagues in Egypt and through the opening of the Red Sea and through all of his provision, and that he is wise in the way he orders things to bring himself glory and for the good of his people. But he particularly shows his people that he cares for them, that he is good. So this is the reality that Naomi grew up in, knowing this God, and who revealed himself by the name of Yahweh, or as we say in English often, Jehovah. She believed in a Jehovah as her king, an unseen, an uncaused causer, an uncreated creator who was not distant but cared for his people. But these were hard days in the shadow of the Exodus, and in the house of bread, this good God allowed a famine. And this was the beginning of her bitterness. You know, these are vital days to teach our children who God is. A lot of times our own lives follow that redemptive arc, and as a young child, hopefully, it should be this way for all children, that they start off their lives without a care in the world, knowing that their parents care about them and are there for them and love one another and love them. That's why divorce can be very destructive for a young child. And so as parents, it is vital that we teach our children at this stage in their life who their good God is, that he is wise and he is good and he is all-powerful. We teach them here at our church that God is sovereign because when they come into these times of famine in the land, that they will remember this. These are also days to remember that God is faithful. He is the Alpha and Omega, and he has, as he has been, he forever will be. I remember our kids when they were about the age of Ryan and Jacob here and others that have children in elementary school. I would be stressed out about something and talk to them maybe about some of that, and I'd ask them what they're worried about, and they would say, "We're not worried about anything, we're kids." They were very aware that they have nothing to worry about, but someday they will. And this is what it was like for Israel. They could look back and remember how God, by his sovereign hand, took care of them and redeemed them. Secondly, though, bitterness comes into the house of bread, and a famine came into the land. We don't know about a mass exodus to the Moabite land, but for some reason, Elimelech and Naomi decided to leave the promised land, potentially not to trust God that he would provide for them through the famine, and to go find food elsewhere. This is where she began to experience the real bitterness. She was met with adversity there. Surely she thought, this is Bethlehem, house of bread, but it sure doesn't feel like it. This is not supposed to be the land of famine. And so the circumstances in her home country caused her to move to a foreign land where her husband, Elimelech, God is king, died. But that's not all. Her sons married Moabite women, and Moabites were a tribe of people that the law says in Deuteronomy were not allowed to join the people of Israel for 10 generations because of how they treated God's people on their way to the promised land. And so they married women who the written Torah, the law of Moses, said could not be a part of God's people for 10 generations. That's a long time. You know, people barely even remember the name of their great-grandparents. If I asked you, I would say most of you would have a hard time remembering, let alone the name of your great-great-grandparents. 10 generations? That was what the reality that these two men had married into, but then they had died, leaving Naomi with 2 Moabite daughter-in-laws. Naomi shows her love for them by encouraging them to go back to their people and remarry where they could have children. In those days, women did not have careers where they could take care of themselves. They were completely dependent on the men around them. And this particular woman, Naomi, and her daughter-in-laws were left without any. The difference between Naomi and her daughter-in-laws is that her daughter-in-laws were left with a chance to still get married, have children, have a husband that would take care of her, and sons that could take care of them. But she is absolutely destitute. What it would mean is that wherever she would live, she would have to, like the poorest and lowest of people, after the harvest has happened, go in behind the harvesters and pick up the gleanings, pick up what is left in the field, do the hard work on her own of turning it into meal, making it into bread, and eating just enough to survive for the rest of her life, or at least until she physically could not, and then she would be left to beg. And this was what she was facing. So her pleasantness that she was named after was turned to bitterness. How do we handle the bitter taste of dashed hopes? People love to talk about suffering people, and I think when she came back into Bethlehem, the people were at least entertained by her suffering. Here in verse 19, it says that the two of them, so this was Naomi and now her daughter-in-law Ruth, went on until they came back to the house of bread. When they came in, the whole town was stirred, the Bible says, and they said about them, "Is this Naomi?" They said, "Is this pleasant?" They said it ironically because she did not look pleasant. She was wearing black, the color of mourning, and her daughter-in-law, who was also a widow, was wearing black, and they were likely weeping. And they said, "Is this pleasant?" And she said, "Don't call me pleasant. Call me bitter." And she said this. She said, "The Almighty has dealt bitterly with me. I went away full. The Lord has brought me back empty. So why call me pleasant when the Lord has testified against me and the Almighty has brought calamity upon me?" What what Naomi is expressing to the Bethlehemites at this moment was lament. She was expressing sorrow for the bitter life she was experiencing. This is a good moment to stop and think about lamenting in times of bitterness and in sorrow. There's a few things that we can see here from Naomi that God has ordained about lamenting sorrow and bitterness. And I'll tell you just 3 of them real quick. First of all is that you should express it. What is the difference, though, between inappropriate and appropriate expression of lament? 1/3 of the Psalms begin as laments. That must be appropriate because God told us to sing these songs and to read these songs and to feel these songs. But the Hebrews in the wilderness lamented, but they lamented to their own damnation. They complained against God. So what is the difference between the lament God wants us to have and the lament that gets us into God's anger? Well, it could be described this way if you look at the Psalms and if you look at the people in the wilderness. There is bitterness that is expressed to God, and it's paired with obedience, and that equals faith. And this is what Naomi was doing. She was expressing her bitterness, but she was returning. 5 times in this chapter, it uses the word returns, that she returned to Bethlehem. She returned to her people. She returned to the house of bread. But bitterness expressed about God with disobedience is rebellion. Some Christians, I think, going on our sermon from last week, Rejoice in the Lord Always, can't deal with lament. They can't deal with sorrow or expressing sorrow, and they want us always to say happy things, right? And they may even think that I'm kind of being a Debbie Downer. I apologize to Deb for using that word. I just recognize we have a Deb with us here today. I'll just say a downer. That's more fair to everybody named Debbie. And say, why are you being so negative? Shouldn't we just focus on the positives and rejoice? Well, the reality is there's a whole lot of reasons in this room today to lament, and there will be for each of us in our lives reasons to lament. And we have to deal with that, and the cross deals with that. We talked about that at the beginning, but the good news is that Naomi's lament was not perfect. She may have crossed the line into accusing God. It says here that she said that the Almighty has brought calamity upon me. See, Ruth didn't wonder if God was almighty. She wondered if he was good to her because of what she was experiencing. But the good news here is that God is patient with our imperfect expressions of lament. In your pain, it's better to cry out to God and express your lament and sorrow, and He'll be patient with it. Secondly, though, don't romanticize yesterday. She said, I went away full, but I came back empty. Reality is she went away starving in a famine. We often remember our past when we're going through a excruciatingly difficult time as if it were perfect. But the reality is that we shouldn't romanticize that. And thirdly, don't ignore God's goodness today. Naomi said nothing of Ruth, who had given up her life to be her friend, which is what Ruth's name meant. She said nothing of the fact that God had visited his people and brought them bread so that she could survive. She said nothing of the fact that she was still alive. So one thing to remember in lament is to not ignore the goodness that God continues to give us today. God is still wise, powerful, and good when we are experiencing the deepest experience of bitterness. He sees you, and He knows you, and He cares. The third, though, after bitterness that we see is this no-name woman, Ruth. And we're going to look at her life between verses 4 and 18, and we're not going to reread what Hannah read, but basically she, along with Orpah, her sister-in-law, wept over Naomi, but she was different than Orpah. She refused to leave Naomi. And here in verses 15 through 17, or 16 through 17, one of the most poetic commitments to Jehovah God, a conversion, leaving of idols to come to God, is written in all of Scripture as said by this woman, Ruth. Look at what she says in verse 16. She says to her mother-in-law, Naomi, do not urge me to leave you or to return from following you, for where you go, I will go. And where you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, and your God, my God. And she didn't stop there, though. She said, where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. She is saying, your God will be my God, not just until you die, but until I die. The god of the Moabites was a god named Chemosh, And she had watched Naomi for these years that she was married to his son. And she had heard about Jehovah God from Naomi. And as Naomi urged her to go home, she was not just urging her to go home and get married, but she was urging her to go back to her God and her idols. And so Ruth said, I will not go back to that God, even if it means dying a destitute widow after you die. Because really the person who was having it the worst was not Naomi, but Ruth. And Ruth was doing it willingly. She had options, and she chose to leave mother and father and lands and idols in order to cling to the God of the Bible. She tied herself in her own death to God. Ruth's new name, thus, was given friendship. This is a true picture of friendship. In fact, we are all Ruths and Orpahs, people born in this world with names that are foreign from God, a people separated from God and his people, children of sin, but seeing a distant light. So will you tie yourself to the God of the Bible in your bitterness, or will you return to the morsels in Moab given by the gods of those people? The fourth spot, and the lowest point, we find a promise. And we're going to jump from chapter 1 to chapter 2. And the story goes that Naomi and Ruth go back to Bethlehem, and Ruth is the one, because of her age, she's still able to go out, and she goes and she's gleaning the wheat that's left over by the harvesters. A man named Boaz sees her. We often call Boaz the kinsman redeemer, see him as the central focus or figure of the story. There is a reason, though, that the Hebrews named the story Ruth. He sees Ruth out in the harvest, and he begins to supply her not just with those scraps, but with abundant amount of wheat. So she's carrying home baskets. And she has this question in verse 10 of Boaz. She says, "Why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I am a foreigner?" And this is what Boaz says, and it's extremely instructive about the promises and the character of God. He says this in verse 11 from the mouth of Boaz. "All that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband has been fully told to me, and how you left your father and mother and your native land, and came to a people that you did not know before. The Lord repay you for what you have done, and a full reward be given you by the Lord, the God of Israel." And notice especially this phrase, "the God of Israel, under whose wings you have come to take refuge." At Ruth and Naomi's lowest moment, gleaning from the fields of others, God sends, by complete chance of circumstance, a man named Boaz who speaks these words of promise, that God of Israel, look what it says, the name of God. This word here, the God of Israel, if you were to hear that in Hebrew, that would be Elohim Ya Israel. The God, this is the title, but not just that, Jehovah, the God Jehovah of Israel. He is a relational God. So Ruth had a surprising fame that she didn't expect, because nobody would leave father and mother and native lands to go to a land of a people that aren't your land, to die as a widow, uncared for in poverty. But Ruth saw poverty among the people of God to be more desirable than riches in Moab. And God, Jehovah, Elohim, Jehovah Ya Israel, he saw this, and he will not be unfaithful to not repay. The New Testament confirms this, that God is our faithful rewarder. God said to Abraham, "I am your great reward." What Ruth received then was a God who sees and a God who rewards. And what did she do, though, to receive that reward? How do we know that God will redeem our bitterness? It's found in this short phrase here, "under whose wings you have come to take refuge." She took refuge under the wings of Jehovah. You know, we live much of our lives in that dip of that redemptive arc at the bottom. where we feel like we have nowhere else to go. We feel like our hopes and our dreams are a huge, long way away that we can't even see them. In those moments, those who can be confident that God will redeem all of their bitterness are only those who take refuge under the wings of God. So are you taking refuge under his wings today? And what does that look like? Well, it looks like trusting him. It looks like looking back to his faithfulness and looking forward to his promises. Finding comfort in him to meet your needs, not comfort from a man or a woman, or comfort in money or power or skill or pleasure or hobbies, but all of the physical, emotional longings, the justice that we long for, the honor that we long for, the partnership that we long for, that we find it under the wings of God. So how do you know if you're doing this? Well, would you leave all to follow God and to find refuge under his wings? If the whole world were offered to you, or at least a chance of it the way it was to Ruth, would you leave that all to find refuge under the wing of Jehovah? Ruth did. And it was that faith that Boaz gave her the promise, the Lord will repay you. Your God, under whom you take refuge under his wings, Christian, is not unfaithful. And he will reward that faith that he has himself ordained. So in a space of 2 days, in fact, he rewarded this. This happened on day 1 that night. And the next day all happens in chapter 2 and 3, where Boaz comes and redeems Ruth, marries Ruth. They have a child in chapter 4. The child didn't happen in 2 days, but the whole redemption happened in just a few short time, in just 48 hours. And God can turn your circumstances around just like that, according to his timing. And so the next, and getting toward the end, is that he gives Ruth a redeemed name. Look what it says in chapter 4 and in verse 13. Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And if you wonder, it's interesting why Boaz married Ruth. It was not because she was beautiful. The book does not say anything about her beauty. In fact, Boaz had offered her and all of the property of Elimelech to another man who would not dirty and sully himself by marrying a Moabite woman. And only after nobody else would take her, he takes her. Why? Chapter 2 tells us because she took refuge under the wings of God, and Boaz said, he will repay you. And so this is what it says. Boaz took Ruth, she became his wife, he went into her, and the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. If you go back one, Alex, real quick, to the previous slide. He gave her a redeemed name, and the name of her son was Obed. And if you speak Arabic again, this will help you because the name Abed means slave or servant, and Obed meant servant of God. And so Ruth, the friend, was given a name by the people in Bethlehem, and her name was Obed, which is the mother of the servant of God. So instead of being a foreigner, a rejected Moabite, she became the mother of God's servant, which is a title that Jesus Christ himself would be known by. And so this no-name woman received the name of the mother, not only of Obed, but mother of King David and mother of Jesus Christ, our Messiah. Her honor would only increase with time, generation after generation, as the mother of Obed, the mother of David, and the mother of Jesus. It was compounding generationally. Why? Again, because she sheltered under the wings of Jehovah. God has made us his own, and he's given us a name if you've found shelter under the cross of Christ, if we leave mother and father and ethnicity and lands to treasure him above all things, to die to self and to find refuge under his wings. And that's where we find that God, through the redemption of Ruth, redeems Naomi. If you go to the next one, Alex. And he names her Pleasant again. Look what it says here in verse 14. The women of of Bethlehem said to Naomi, and that name bitter never stuck. They didn't call her Mara, bitter, the rest of her life because she wanted to. The name bitter did not stick on her, and they called her pleasant again. And look what they said to her. Blessed be the Lord who has not left you this day without a redeemer. And may his name be renowned in Israel. He shall be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age. For your daughter-in-law who loves you, who is more to you than 7 sons, has given birth to him. So Obed was going to be her restorer of life, her redeemer. But that's not all. Naomi is an ancient case for motherhood, I think. Our current culture doesn't give mother and motherhood the value that it deserves, because you will never suffer near the pain in your career that you will in having children and loving them for their lives, but you will also you will not experience near the honor and reward that you will for motherhood. So the most important thing you do in life is your relationships, not the things you accomplish. And the most important thing that you can do in a work situation is to mother, and this could be spiritually as well, is to be a mother of people. And so Ruth is an ancient case as well for not putting the weight of your life's meaning on your children. That is, that she left the opportunity to have children in order to follow God. And so our kids are not to be the meaning that we're looking for, but they are to be honored. And I think we see this, the motherhood should be honored. We see this in the story of Ruth. And finally, we see at the end that Jehovah did redeem. The last words of this book is the name David, that through Ruth, God brought Obed, who was the father of Jesse, who was the father of David. And anybody who's read the Bible, you know that that's pointing to Jesus, the king who would come, the son of David. Matthew chapter 1 includes Ruth in the story, and the lineage includes, and it references Jesus as the son of David. So God has done all that he did in Egypt to redeem them, and he will redeem through Obed and David. But for you, God has done all that he needed to do in the redemption of us by the resurrection of Christ from the dead. And no matter the bitterness you're experiencing today, he will, in his second coming, he will redeem all the bitterness of your life. Your name, no matter what you're going through, will not be known as bitter. Because of Christ, it will be pleasant. David points then to this Messiah, who is the Alpha and the Omega. This week, I found myself numerous times talking to people who were despairing of their marriage, in the bottom of that valley, wondering if there's redemption in that, and walking with a spouse through death's door, and other things. I found myself telling them this truth that we see in Ruth, and the story of Ruth is a greater truth that we see only magnified in Christ. That while we experience the pain of death on Friday and the coldness of the grave on Saturday, that there is a Sunday in Christ. There is a Sunday. Don't quit. Sunday is coming. So, will God redeem your bitterness, no matter what it is? Answer is from Ruth, and the whole Bible screams it to us. God is faithful to redeem the bitterness for all those who take refuge under his wings. But our soul sometimes needs to feel that. And so we're going to sing this song, Be Still My Soul. This is an old song written almost 300 years ago, originally in German, then translated later by a Scottish woman into English. They made a newer version of it that we're going to sing, and it's one that I've been singing to myself all week, and I want to give it to you. It has 4 wonderful verses, and the first says, Be still my soul, the Lord is on your side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to your God to order and provide. In every change, he faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, your best, your heavenly friend, your heavenly Ruth, through thorny ways leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul, your God does undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Your hope, your confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he lived below. We're going to take that poem and sing it together as a song of faith. If you've not come under the wing of Jehovah, this song can be your song of prayer where you give your life to him. And if you have, surely there'll be bitterness or is bitterness that you're trusting the Lord for. And this song can be a song, an anthem of hope and praise to the Lord. Would you stand with me and sing this song together with Clayton?
Be still, my soul, the Lord is on your side. Bear patiently the cross of grief or pain. Leave to thy God to order and provide. In every change, he faithful will remain. Be still, my soul, thy best, thy heavenly friend. Through thorny ways leads to a joyful end. Be still, my soul, thy God doth undertake to guide the future as he has the past. Thy hope, thy confidence, let nothing shake. All now mysterious shall be bright at last. Be still, my soul, the waves and winds still know his voice who ruled them while he dwelt below. In you I rest, in you I found my hope, in you I trust, you never let me go. I place my